Greetings, my name is Rich Frazee and I have the awesome privilege of serving as an instructor at the University of Wisconsin Independent Learning, teaching music courses, and also serving as a board member of ADEAL. And I'm very excited to be presenting to you today. We're going to be talking about activities that we can use for online research, specifically finding, evaluating, and incorporating online resources. In general, as students learn how to research, especially with online sources, it's important that they be able to examine and critique the quality of their sources and have ideas on how to incorporate their findings into their work. Today we're going to be looking at 3 online research activities that are used in one of University of Wisconsin Independent Learning's courses. These activities focus on evaluating the credibility of resources, finding and summarizing relevant online scholarly sources, and also using these sources to outline a paper or a project. Ideas on how to adapt these activities for other courses and field of studies will be discussed. A PDF of these 3 activities are included at the following link. So you can download that, and we'll be looking at these examples pretty regularly throughout the presentation. Now, these activities were drawn from something that's called WebQuests. You can learn more about WebQuests at webquest.org. And the idea of a WebQuest is it's an inquiry-oriented lesson format in which most or all of the information that learners work with comes from the web. That's again from webquest.org. And generally, a WebQuest includes the following. It has an introduction. Generally, this is simply a short paragraph that introduces the material. There's a task. This could involve learning objectives. For example, why are the students going through this? What knowledge or skills will be attained? That includes the process. Essentially, this is the meat and potatoes of the activity. This is the prompt. This is the question that your student completes. And finally, we have a conclusion, essentially recapping what the student did, perhaps briefly summarizing learning objectives or big takeaways that you want students to have. So let's dive into these examples. They were created by Sarah Corpy and Joan Bell Cowell of UW Independent Learning, and they're for a course on the writer Ernest Hemingway. So the very first one, number 1, focuses on finding out preliminary information on Hemingway using both general and scholarly resources. So if we look at activity number 1, discover Hemingway. We have an introduction, just a short paragraph describing what we're doing. So the main purpose of this activity is for you to form for yourself an image of Hemingway as a person. And the second purpose of this activity is to conduct an internet search using reliable sources. So we have then the task. We have learning objectives that are included there. And then again, we get to the meat and potatoes, the process. So it says to complete this web quest, review the resources below, then complete the content reflection document. So there's part A, a general search, where students can use any general search engine that they want to learn more about Ernest Hemingway. And then as they're going through this, they're actively considering what kind of web resources did you find? Are they reliable? How do you know? And then just kind of thinking about in which circumstances would it be appropriate to use these web resources. Then we have part B, the scholarly search, where students are now using at least 2 scholarly search engines to look up more information about Ernest Hemingway. And then again, as they're going through, students are answering what kind of web resources did they find? Are these web resources reliable? How do they know? And in which circumstances would it be appropriate to use these web resources? And then they have a reflection, and as they're going through these reflections, they have to answer, do you consider these sources reliable, and how or why do you know? Now, you can take this basic framework and adapt it to a wide variety of settings. Give students a subject matter to research, have them search with both general and scholarly sources, have them summarize what they learned, and have them evaluate the different sources that they used. Now, as a disclaimer, I'm by no means a Hemingway expert, but I've been able to adapt this assignment in some of my courses. For example, in Appreciation and History of Music, the format is generally the same. In our 3rd unit, we cover music of the Baroque era, and I have students research a composer of their choice from this time period. They first search using 2 different general sources, and then they use 2 different scholarly sources. After that, they compare what they learned from the different sources and evaluate the quality of the sources. Part of this is to prepare them for units in the end of my course where they independently do research of their own choices of music. This is all well and good. Students learn about a subject, but we also hope that they learn how wonderful scholarly sources are. And there is something implied that something that we get from JSTOR or Google Scholar is going to be better than Google or Wikipedia. And I'll admit that as an instructor, I hope that the students learn to use these more powerful scholarly sources. But I must admit some observations in student reflections from this assignment. First, Google and Wikipedia are generally more user-friendly than scholarly sources. To go back to how I use this in Appreciation and History of Music, I have a number of students who will look up Antonio Vivaldi. They'll go to Wikipedia, and the webpage starts with a nice, succinct summary about who Vivaldi is. There's a section about his life and career, his legacy, and a section that lists his work. It's great information that's clearly displayed. After using these general sources, students will then try something like Google Scholar. First, they may not be able to access the source. Maybe they need to log into an institution, so it's not as user-friendly. And when researching something like an Italian composer, they might encounter something that's in Italian. It could be a great source, but unless they're fluent in Italian, it may not be of much help. Or maybe they discover a primary source like a photograph of Vivaldi's own manuscript. Or maybe they found an article that goes into complex analyses. These are all great things to discover, but my students are generally non-majors taking a general degree requirement. Some of them absolutely love music and are excited about learning more about it. Others, they just need a C to graduate. And for those students, Google and Wikipedia will give them fine general information that's easy to navigate. So then why have them go through this exercise at all if their experience can kind of install that Wikipedia is easier to use than a scholarly source? First, it's worthwhile for students to be actively thinking about the quality of the internet sources of information. As they complete this activity, they are specifically considering, are the web sources reliable? How do you know? As I have students go through this, they'll look for, who authored the information. It forces them to at least consider the validity of a source instead of assuming that, well, it must be true because it's on the internet. We're helping develop critical thinking as they're going through these sources. Second, students are working with scholarly sources that aren't as user-friendly as Google, but that's not the point of these sources. There are certainly times for user-friendly in learning. For example, a user-friendly online learning environment. That's important. Being able to clearly understand how to navigate through a course. That's important, but there's nothing wrong with giving students some guidance and direction to learn how to use powerful, if not as easy to use, resources. The point is that we have these peer-reviewed texts written by experts in their field that students have the chance to look at material at a deeper level. As I said before, my students aren't necessarily majoring in music or pursuing music studies at the graduate level. However, most of my students are majoring in something, and these sources are likely going to come in handy to whatever that something is that they're majoring in. Their professors might be suggesting resources, but that's not a given. Our students come from all kinds of backgrounds. With online learning, you can have students from all over the world. And there's no guarantee that these students have encountered JSTOR or Google Scholar. Now, after going through these exercises, they have more tools in their academic toolbox. Let's take a look at the second activity. Now, in the second web quest, students are exploring themes of Hemingway's works and have to find and summarize 3 scholarly sources and evaluate which 2 sources might work well for writing an essay. Again, we have an introduction. It says the main purpose of this activity is for you to develop a deeper understanding of Hemingway's worldview. And the second purpose of this activity is for you to locate reliable sources that will be useful for you in writing your module for the paper. Then we have a task that has some learning objectives, and then we have the process. So we start with the process, As you explore resources available for your project, please answer the following questions. First it asks some background information about what they did in previous units. Then it asks which text of Hemingway is going to be the subject. It asks about which worldview of Hemingway we're looking into. And then here we start getting into the online searching. Conduct a search using one or more of the scholarly search engines that you have already explored. And then students compile a list of articles that they've found using these scholarly search engines. Then they jot down the main ideas or key arguments. And finally, students say, look at which of these two articles would make a good potential secondary source for an essay. And again, why is that? So again, having students actively thinking about these things. Essentially, by completing this web quest, we have in the conclusion, students are exploring a variety of reliable secondary sources that may be of use to complete a written assignment. Now here is where the scholarly sources, in my opinion, become more clearly helpful than the general sources. We're not just looking up general information about Hemingway, we're getting into higher level themes about his writing. Again, disclaimer, I am not a Hemingway scholar. However, the themes that are included in this web quest, religion, code behavior, etc., they aren't in the Wikipedia page, but a quick search in Google Scholar generated relevant results. Now, as we look at the third web quest, students examine 4 short stories. They look for examples of literary devices, either symbolism or metaphor, and they review scholarly sources that examine different themes in Hemingway's works, and they connect the dots with what they've analyzed, what they've discovered that experts had analyzed, and generally discuss overarching themes found throughout the works of Ernest Hemingway. So we've looked at 3 different online research activities that have been used with this Hemingway course. Now, just some general thoughts on how you can adapt these for your own courses. The first activity is, in my opinion, pretty easy to adapt for college level courses. Essentially, you pick a topic or you pick a subject for students to learn about. This example used Hemingway. I use a composer from the Baroque period, and you have students just search for this topic using general and scholarly sources. You can use these sources included, you can add other sources for your liking, and have them reflect on what they found and how they found it. The other 2 activities, in my opinion, take a little more creative work to adapt. They're not as plug and go, and you'll need to be consciously directing students as you create your prompts. For example, the second web quest had students choose between 4 different worldviews of Ernest Hemingway. But as you guide students to research in your field of study, perhaps you have them look up different opinions or academic camps. As a student, it is interesting to read articles of scholars who are just responding to or arguing with each other. Or you can have them look at different trends or theories or interpretations or reviews. Now, if you're adapting the third web quest, you can prompt students to compile different analyses on similar topics. For example, if I was using this in one of my music courses, I might have students try to work through 2 different articles with analyses or receptions of 4 different compositions from the same composer. In particular, if your course has a final paper, this could be an activity to go through the research process as they compile sources and information. So here's something that I love about these activities. Students are using internet sources, and just with the nature of the internet, that means that the number of sources available to them are constantly growing, and that generally there's current, up-to-date information. For example, in one of my music courses, I have students look up the 10 most recent winners or recipients of the Pulitzer Prize in Music. That's something that doesn't go out of date. They can always look up the 10 most recent recipients of that prize. In general, they just have these opportunities and tools to look up information, and as they've gone through these activities, again, they have the chance to consciously think, what am I finding? Is this reliable? And why? How do I know that this is reliable? If you have any questions or comments, I would love to hear from you. I'm at jrfrazee@wisc.edu, and I'd especially love to hear if you have ideas of how you use online research-based activities with your students. Send them our way. We love to hear from you. Again, thank you so much for watching this presentation. I hope you've learned some great ideas. We'll see you next time. Take care.